She sat with her back against the concrete wall, legs folded beneath her, one arm cradling the limp weight of her son, the other holding a torn piece of cardboard that trembled slightly in the early morning breeze. The handwriting was crooked, written with the last working pen she had in the house, the ink already smudging from the moisture in the air. It read, "He just needs a doctor, that was all. No plea for money, no dramatic display, no performance. Just the truth, stripped bare, of all the layers that life usually demands." Her son's small chest rose and fell unevenly, a wheezing sound escaping his mouth every time he exhaled. His eyes were half closed, unfocused. He hadn't spoken since last night. A few hours earlier, she had still been knocking on doors. The fee public clinic at the end of their street was closed. Budget cuts, they had said. Only emergencies now, but nobody there seemed to decide what counted as one. The hospital further out was already packed by the time she arrived, a line of people standing under the sun, holding bags of medicine, paperwork, children. She had waited for an hour before someone told her they weren't taking in new patients without referral. She showed them her son's symptoms. They told her to try an NGO, maybe a shelter. By the time she arrived at the nearest one, the woman at the gate simply shook her head without opening it. "We don't do medical. Try social services. Come back tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word felt like a joke. Her son didn't have tomorrow. His forehead was burning. He wasn't crying anymore. That's what terrified her the most. She had spent the night awake beside him, sitting on the edge of their mattress, soaking a cloth in a chipped bowl of water and pressing it to his skin. She had already sold the fan 2 weeks ago to pay the fee. Rent. There was no paracetamol left in the cupboard, no electricity either. The fridge was just an empty box humming into silence. She had boiled water on a borrowed stove and fed him plain rice, the last she could afford. Every time he winced, her heart did too. She whispered to him, called his name softly. She told him stories about superheroes and places with snow, even though he had never seen any. She promised him the fever would break. But it didn't, and now they were here. A private hospital, a place she would never dare to enter. She knew what the receptionist would say before she even got there. She had seen it before, the way they looked past people like her, how they spoke slowly and clearly, like explaining rules to a child. No insurance, no ID, no appointment? Sorry, next. But she had nothing left to lose. Her last option wasn't a door anymore. It was a sidewalk, so she sat. She sat not because it was brave or powerful or defiant. She sat because she couldn't carry him any farther. Her arms were aching from the weight, but she didn't dare put him down. He needed her body heat. He needed to hear her heartbeat. She had heard somewhere that those things helped. She didn't know if it was true, but it was all she had. People walked by, of course. Some glanced at the cardboard sign. Others didn't. A few slowed their pace for a moment, maybe caught off guard by the image of a mother and child sitting quietly in front of a hospital's automatic glass doors. But nobody stopped. They didn't have to. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even moving, just sitting there with her son and a sign. That was easier to ignore than blood or shouting or hunger. Silence is easy to step over. She looked up only once, when a child about her son's age passed by holding his mother's hand. He looked healthy, clean, talking about cartoons. The mother kept her eyes forward, her hand gripping her son's tightly as they passed. The boy turned to look. He noticed, but he didn't say anything. A few steps later, they were gone. She didn't cry, not yet. She had learned a long time ago that crying only drained you. You needed every drop of energy to keep going. And besides, she had already cried yesterday. She had cried the night before when her son said he was too tired to eat. She had cried last week when she opened the mailbox and saw another folded paper with red letters, final notice. She had run out of tears the way people run out of food. Gradually, then, suddenly. Now there was only stillness. Her son's fever was rising. She felt it through his shirt. His breathing had slowed. leaned down and whispered into his ear over and over again, as if the rhythm of her voice could anchor him to this side of things. She said his name. She said, "Stay with me." She said, "Just a little longer." The cardboard sign fluttered again in the wind, barely hanging onto the sidewalk under a single rock she had found nearby. He just needs a doctor. No drama. No threats. No name. Just that. And still, not a single soul stopped. She had not expected anyone to run to her aid. That kind of fantasy had left her years ago, somewhere between the first eviction and the third time she was told to lower her. Voice at the social service counter. But she thought maybe that a hospital would be different. A place with white walls and blue uniforms and the word care stitched onto every sign. A place that existed for people like her, or at least for children like her son. She did not expect mercy. She only expected protocol. She expected someone to at least ask what was wrong. What she got was a security guard who didn't meet her eyes. He stepped out through the side entrance about 30 minutes after she sat down. He looked at her, then at the cardboard, then pulled his radio to his mouth and mumbled something she couldn't hear. She straightened her back, held her son a little closer. The guard didn't come any nearer. He stood there waiting until a second person arrived, a woman in a blazer and ID tag around her neck, holding a clipboard and a kind of practiced impatience in her face. She approached slowly, then knelt a short distance away and spoke with the cautious tone of someone addressing a threat. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. This is private property." The words hit her like a cold splash of water, but she stayed still. "My son is sick," she said, gently lifting the cardboard closer to the woman's line of sight. "I'm not asking for money. I'm not trying to cause trouble. He just needs to be seen." The woman looked at the boy for a moment. Her eyes didn't soften. They stayed flat, professional, unreadable. "We can't accept walk-ins without insurance or a payment method," she said. "We're not an emergency room." The mother tried again, this time with a deeper calm, the kind of calm you use when you are begging without sounding like you are. "Please, I tried everywhere else. No one would see him. He hasn't eaten. He's burning up. I think it's his lungs." But the woman had already begun to rise. "There's a clinic on the west side that offers discounted care. You can take a bus from the terminal 2 blocks east, but you can't stay here." And then she walked back inside. The guard lingered for a moment longer. He didn't say anything, just adjusted his belt and followed her in. The next hour moved in silence. People passed by in waves, some arriving for appointments, others leaving with bandaged arms or prescription bags. A few glanced in her direction, then quickly away. One man in a suit slowed down and offered a few coins, which she didn't take. He looked confused, then shrugged and moved on. She wasn't asking for coins. She wasn't asking for anything she didn't believe her son deserved, just a human glance, just a sliver of attention from someone who had the power to change something. But power moves fast, and she had long ago learned that the powerless are made invisible by pace. Eventually, 2 policemen arrived. She had seen them coming from the corner of her eye. The navy uniforms, the slow approach, the way they looked everywhere but at her. She braced herself. One of them spoke gently, but with the same tone as the hospital woman. "We got a report. They're asking you to move. You can't stay here." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her throat felt tight. She shifted her son gently in her arms to show the boy's flushed face. His breathing was more labored now, audible even to someone standing. One of the officers knelt and looked at the boy. For a second, she thought he might change. His eyes lingered on the child's cracked lips, his shallow chest. But he stood again. "I'm sorry, we're not medical staff. We can call an ambulance. But if you can't pay for it, they won't transport. It's not up to us." The mother nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just asking not to be pushed away." They didn't arrest her. They didn't threaten. But they did wait. They waited for her to leave. for her to understand that even desperation had a limit in front of these doors, that even sorrow had boundaries drawn by policy and profit, that even her child's shallow breaths weren't enough to pierce through the invisible wall between who is helped and who is ignored. So she stayed. She stayed because she didn't have bus fare. She stayed because the clinic 2 blocks away would be closed by the time she walked there. She stayed because her son could barely stay awake, and every bump, every step, every jostle could be the one that pushed him over an edge she couldn't see. She stayed because even if they moved her, she would only return. The light above the hospital door flickered once, then steadied. The glass door slid open and shut over and over again, letting in the ones who belonged, keeping out the ones who didn't. And somewhere just beyond them, an entire building full of trained professionals moved through their routines, checking charts, drawing blood, placing cold instruments on warm skin. She could almost hear them. She wondered if any of them had children. She wondered if they remembered what it felt like to be afraid, not frightened. Afraid. The kind of fear that sits inside your stomach like a stone, cold and quiet, not shaking, just heavy. She adjusted her son's shirt, wiping his forehead with the sleeve of her own. He stirred, barely, and whimpered something she couldn't understand. She kissed the top of his head. Her lips lingered there. His skin was still burning, and not one door had opened. The day began to thin into the kind of late afternoon that carries no warmth, only shadow. The sidewalk had grown quieter. The rush of morning appointments and lunchtime urgency had passed, replaced by occasional footsteps and the low murmur of traffic in the distance. She shifted her weight against the cold stone wall, legs asleep beneath her, her arms aching from holding her son for so long. Her back had stiffened, her hands were numb, but she didn't move. She barely blinked. Every movement felt like a risk, like something might fall apart if she let go for even a second. Her son's breathing had changed again, slower now, shallow, like his body was conserving something. She whispered to him, just to keep him anchored. Small things, memories. "Remember the puddle you jumped in last week?" she said, her lips near his ear. "Remember how your shoes squished for hours?" He didn't respond. His skin was damp with sweat that smelled faintly of vinegar. His cheeks, flushed earlier, now looked pale in places. It was the kind of quiet that terrified her more than any screaming ever could. She had learned that when a child stops crying, it's not because they're better. It's because they've given up trying to explain how much it hurts. The cardboard sign had collapsed once in the breeze, its edges curling from the weight of the air and time. She had picked it up and tried to smooth it out, then placed it back under a pebble she found by the curb. The words were still visible. "He just needs a doctor." Smudged, but clear enough. She had written them in one breath that morning, barely able to keep her hand steady. She hadn't thought about what it would look like. She just needed to say something simple enough for a stranger to understand. But maybe it wasn't the simplicity that failed. Maybe it was the assumption that anyone was reading. Hunger crept into her slowly. She had not eaten since the night before, not properly. Just a few crackers. She didn't know if her son had eaten at all. He hadn't asked for food. That alone told her everything. The energy it took to feel hunger was already too much for him. She remembered packing a small cloth bag before leaving the house. It was sitting behind her now, half tucked under her sweater. Inside was a bottle of water, a worn-out pair of socks, 2 diapers, and an old photo of her son as a baby, taken during better days when they lived in a shared room with a working stove and a neighbor who sometimes brought over soup. She hadn't looked at the photo in a long time. Now, it felt like a different life entirely, someone else's child. Time began to warp. 10 minutes felt like an hour. The passing of shadows across the pavement became her only clock. The sun dipped lower behind the hospital, casting a longer shadow across her son's small face. She wiped the sweat from his temple with the edge of her sleeve again, then gently repositioned his head on her arm. He whimpered. She shushed him with a sound she had used since he was a newborn, a quiet hum that had calmed him during fevers, colic, nightmares. He didn't react this time. His limbs stayed loose. She began to speak softly to herself, not words, just sounds, breath and syllables and fragments of lullabies. She needed something to hold her together. Silence was beginning to press against her from every side. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that feels like being buried, the kind that grows heavier the longer you endure it. She thought about walking, about standing up and carrying him somewhere, anywhere. But her legs wouldn't respond. And even if they did, where would she go? She didn't have money for a ride. She didn't have a phone. Her sister had stopped answering 6 months ago. The neighbors upstairs had moved out. The woman downstairs had her own children, and they never spoke much. She had asked everyone she could, politely, without demanding, without crying, just with the quiet desperation of a mother who knows she is running out of time. And now, even her body was giving up. Her spine burned. Her arms trembled when she adjusted the blanket around her son, but she refused to lay him down. She had heard that the ground could steal warmth from a child faster than the air. She didn't know if it was true, but it sounded like something. She couldn't afford to test. She began counting breaths, not hers. His 1, 2, 3. A pause, 4. Each one a fragile thread keeping him here. She whispered his name every 5th breath, just to keep something familiar echoing through the fog of his fever. She told him about the toy truck they had seen in the store window last week. She promised him he could touch it, maybe even takes it home. She knew she couldn't afford it. Not now, maybe never. But promises were a mother's only currency in moments like this. And she would spend every one she had. A woman walked by pushing a stroller. She glanced briefly at the pair on. The ground then looked away, her hand tightening around the stroller's handle. A delivery man stopped nearby to check his phone, his eyes skimming across the cardboard sign without stopping. A teenager in a school uniform passed by, chewing gum and scrolling through a screen. None of them stopped. The world kept turning. The traffic light down the street changed from green to red and back again. The city breathed around her, untouched by her stillness. The hours bled into each other. At some point she stopped looking at the hospital doors. She already knew what they would not do. She stopped hoping that someone inside might look out. She stopped believing that anyone else would see her son the way she did. She stopped asking for the things she had already been told she could not have. And yet, she stayed, not because she had hope, but because she had nothing else left to give. Nightfall brought a cold that felt almost cruel, not bitter enough to be sharp, but slow, creeping, the kind of chill that slides beneath your clothing and settles into your bones without asking. The hospital's lights glowed brighter now, sterile and indifferent. Inside, behind the thick panes of glass and security checkpoints, life continued under fluorescent certainty. Nurses changing shifts, patients wheeled to their rooms, the quiet rhythm of regulated care. Outside, on the pavement, no longer warmed. By the sun, a mother sat hunched over her child, her body wrapped around his like armor, like shelter, like denial. Her son had not spoken in hours, not a word. His breathing had grown faint, each inhale a labor, each exhale a mercy. His skin, once flushed with fever, had turned waxy and pale. His hands were no longer warm. She tried to rub them between her own, whispering into his hair, repeating his name like a chant, like a plea, like a spell, but he did not stir. He had retreated somewhere she could not follow. And in that space between his breaths, something began to fray inside her. For a while, she remained still, not from peace, but from paralysis. Her mind began to disassociate, float above her body, observe her as though she were a stranger. She could see herself, a woman on the ground clutching a child, her sweater soaked through from the light rain that had come and gone. Her hair matted, her face hollow. She looked like someone who had been there for weeks, not hours. She looked like someone who had been forgotten long before she ever sat down. When the sob came, it did not arrive gently. It tore through her chest like a scream she could not release. She bit her lip to keep it from rising, but it pressed upward, heavier than breath, louder than thought. Her shoulders shook. She turned her face away from the hospital windows, ashamed of the sound her grief made, as if even now, in this moment of unraveling, she owed the world her silence. She pressed her forehead against her son's, closing her eyes tight. For a moment she imagined he responded. A twitch of a finger, a shift of weight, anything. But it was only the wind. It had picked up, pushing garbage along the sidewalk, lifting the corners of the cardboard sign again. The words were almost gone now, water-streaked and fading. He just needs a doctor. The sentence barely clung to the paper anymore, just as the boy barely clung to the world. She began to rock, back and forth, a rhythm without music, a motion not of comfort, but of memory, the way she had rocked him as a baby, through colic, through hunger, through nights when he couldn't sleep. Back then, he had responded. He had calmed in her arms. His breath would slow, his eyes would close, and he would drift into a peace she could not afford for herself. Now his body was slack, and her rocking only emphasized the absence of any reaction. Still, she did it, because it was all she had. Movement, contact, presence. A nurse exited the building at one point holding a takeout bag and a coat. She paused briefly, looking down at the pair on the sidewalk. The mother noticed her only as a blur through tear-swelled eyes. Their eyes met for less than a second. The nurse looked away and continued walking. Maybe she had seen too much that week. Maybe she had learned, as many do, to look but not see. Or maybe she thought someone else would handle it, that there must be a system in place, a solution, a protocol, because surely no one would let a child die outside a hospital, but there was no system, not for this mother, not for this child, not for those who don't belong in the right database or behind the right door. There were rules, yes, and rules have teeth when you come to them empty-handed. By midnight, the mother could no longer feel her legs. She had shifted the boy so that he lay across her lap, his head resting in the crook of her elbow, his body covered with her coat. She didn't remember taking it off. Her thoughts had begun to scatter, drifting into disjointed loops of memory and prayer. She remembered holding him for the first time in that overcrowded delivery room with peeling paint. She remembered the way his fingers wrapped around her thumb. She remembered his laugh, his real laugh, not the forced giggles, but the deep belly laugh that came when he was surprised by joy. She tried to speak again, but her voice broke in her throat. Her mouth moved, but the sound didn't come. Her body had entered a state beyond exhaustion. There was no name for it, no diagnosis. Just a slow, quiet disintegration, and then for a moment she thought it was over. She thought he had stopped breathing altogether. She froze. Her hands trembled. She held her breath to listen better. 1 second, 2, then, barely audible. The whisper of an inhale. He was still here, but barely. That was when it finally happened. She broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Something inside her simply gave out, not like glass shattering, but like a rope snapping after too much weight. She collapsed forward, forehead resting against her child's chest, arms limp at her sides. The tears came again, slow and thick, leaking from the corners of her eyes, sliding down her nose. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't move. And in that posture, broken, silent, invisible, she began to say goodbye. Not out loud, not even fully in thought, but deep in the part of a mother that knows when something precious is slipping through her fingers. She stopped asking for help. She stopped hoping. She simply stayed, and the night continued without her. The street had quieted almost completely. The only sounds were the distant buzz of streetlights and the rhythmic sweep of passing cars farther down the avenue. The hospital behind her stood tall and indifferent, lit from within like a beacon that, welcomed everyone except the ones who needed it most. Inside, nurses walked briskly between rooms, monitors beeped, metal carts rolled across polished floors. It was a different world, one that moved on a different kind of time, a place where urgency had structure and care came with paperwork and cost. But out here, beneath that very structure, something sacred had unfolded unnoticed. The mother no longer moved. Her body, curled around her son, had stilled into something beyond rest. Her face was blank, her breathing shallow. She hadn't fainted, she hadn't fallen asleep. She was simply hollow now, as if the fight had left her all at once. Her arms were still wrapped protectively around the boy, but she no longer checked. His forehead no longer whispered promises. There was nothing left to say. She had said everything, in silence, in stillness, in showing up, sitting down, and not leaving, even as the world turned its back. And then something shifted, not in her, but around her. The hospital's side door opened again. A young nurse stepped outside, rubbing her eyes, her bag slung across her shoulder. She was new, still learning the codes, the systems, the rhythms of the building. She had passed the mother earlier that day and had not stopped. Not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but out of fear. Fear of overstepping, of getting in trouble, of doing something that might cost her the job she had fought so hard to get. But guilt has a way of finding people in quiet places. It had sat with her all day, whispering behind every patient she helped. It had followed her into the supply room, down the hallway, into the break room where she stared at her reflection in the vending machine glass. It had taken root in her stomach and refused to move, and now at the end of her shift, she looked again, and this time she didn't see a stranger on the ground. She saw a child, his lips pale, his skin too still, his chest rising in shallow, stuttering movements. She saw a mother whose hands had turned purple from the cold. She saw something that no longer looked like a protest or a plea. It looked like surrender, like the very last moment before something irreversible. She walked closer, slowly. Kneeling beside them, she said softly, "Ma'am?" The mother didn't respond. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. The nurse reached forward and touched the child's wrist. The skin was clammy, the pulse weak, but present. "Oh God," the nurse whispered, reaching for her phone, already dialing the internal code. Her voice trembled. "This is urgent. I need help at the side entrance. Child unconscious, respiratory distress, no ID, no time. Please hurry." What happened next blurred together in a flurry of motion. A stretcher rolled out. 2 paramedics from the ER ran to meet them. Someone took the boy from her arms. For a moment, the mother resisted, holding tighter, her grip reflexive, protective. Then, without a word, she let go. She watched as her son disappeared behind glass doors she had been denied all day. They told her to stay seated while they worked. She didn't argue. She just nodded, eyes glazed. Her arms remained in the shape of holding someone, even though they were empty now. She rocked slightly, as if he were still there. Time passed again in strange ways. She was brought inside finally, but not to a waiting room, a hallway bench. A nurse gave her a blanket, which she didn't touch, a cup of water, which she didn't drink. She stared at the floor, her fingers clenched in her lap, her mind somewhere else entirely. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand updates. She simply waited for good news, for bad news, for anything, for nothing. Then, the same young nurse returned. She sat down beside her and spoke gently. "He's stable. It was a lung infection, treatable. Severe, but not irreversible. He's receiving antibiotics now. We're monitoring him closely." The words floated in the space between them like something fragile. The mother blinked as if pulling herself back into her own body. "He's alive?" she asked, barely more than a whisper. "Yes," the nurse said, "he's alive." And in that moment, the mother didn't cry. She didn't fall apart. She didn't collapse into anyone's arms. She just sat quietly, breathing in for the first time in hours, breathing not for survival, but because her child was breathing too. There were no fireworks, no applause, just two women sitting side by side in a hallway at midnight, one holding the knowledge that she had done everything, and the other realizing she had done something that mattered. The nurse reached over and placed her hand gently on the mother's arm. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Inside the hospital room, machines hummed softly, and the boy's chest rose and fell with steadier rhythm. Outside, the cardboard sign remained on the sidewalk, soggy and unreadable now, but it had done its job, and somewhere, in the quiet, something had shifted. Not the world, but one moment, one life, one breath. That was enough.